They thought they controlled Putin. 5 a.m., October 25th, 2003. Location: Tolmachevo Airport, Novosibirsk, Siberia. Target: Mikhail Khodorkovsky, the richest man in Russia. Net worth: 15 billion. Effective power: control of Yukos, an oil company generating revenue equivalent to roughly 20% of the Russian federal budget. Under the old operating system, Khodorkovsky believed money functioned as a physical shield, that sufficient capital turned private wealth into political immunity, that he was a peer of the state. The new system responded differently, not with negotiations, not with a civilian summons, with a military-style operation. Masked FSB special units surrounded the runway. No warning, no dialogue. Within 120 seconds, the man once described as the owner of Russia was dragged off his private jet, forced into a transport vehicle, and flown to Moscow under guard. At the moment the handcuffs locked, Russia's power equation flipped permanently. The era of money controlling politics ended. The era of politics permitting money to exist began. Confidence established. To understand how this miscalculation happened, you have to rewind to the input data of 1999, not emotions, but structure. At the end of the Yeltsin era, the Kremlin was not operating as a state. It was operating as a stressed holding company. Power was concentrated in two blocks: the family around Boris Yeltsin and the small circle of oligarchs, often referred to as the Seven Bankers. They shared the same problem. Economic collapse had destroyed legitimacy. Yeltsin's health was failing, and when power changed hands, criminal prosecution was a real risk. They did not need a visionary. They did not need a popular politician. They needed a technical solution. The specification was narrow and precise. First, a security background. Someone from the KGB or security services who could keep the military and enforcement agencies aligned. Second, a managerial temperament. A technocrat with no mass base, no personal movement, no independent ambition. Internally, they called this profile the gray mouse. Third, absolute loyalty. Not theoretical, but proven under pressure. Vladimir Putin fit the profile perfectly. At the time, he was a low-profile bureaucrat with no independent power base and no public charisma. What he did have was a documented loyalty signal. In 1997, when his former mentor, Anatoly Sobchak, faced criminal charges, Putin risked his own career to organize a covert flight to extract Sobchak from Russia. To the oligarchs, this was decisive evidence. Boris Berezovsky summarized the assessment bluntly. This man never betrays his master. In August 1999, Putin was appointed prime minister. Almost immediately, he launched the Second Chechen War. The results were measurable. Public approval surged, from single digits to nearly 50% within months. From the elite's perspective, the experiment was working. Their appointed manager was restoring order without challenging ownership. In July 2000, the system appeared to lock in permanently. At a meeting at Kuntsevo Dacha, President Putin gathered 21 of Russia's wealthiest men and proposed what became known as the Grand Bargain. Privatized assets would not be revisited. Private wealth would remain intact. In exchange, taxes would be paid and political interference would cease. No one objected, because in their mental model, nothing fundamental had changed. The state still depended on capital. Putin was still a CEO they had hired. Money still functioned as the final veto. They left the room with absolute confidence. At that moment, from inside the system, the arrangement looked stable, rational, self-enforcing. Confidence peaked, not because of arrogance, but because every visible variable appeared aligned. Contradictions accumulate. They did not lose control all at once. They lost it because they kept assuming it still existed. Once Putin secured the presidency, the system began shifting, quietly, deliberately, and asymmetrically. The first move did not target wealth. It targeted leverage. In August 2000, the Kursk submarine disaster exposed a critical stress test. The state response was slow. Information was fragmented. Public anger spiked. Oligarch-owned television networks reacted instinctively. They amplified criticism. They applied pressure. Under the old operating system, this was how influence worked. Media outrage forced concessions. But Putin was no longer operating under that logic. To the security services, hostile media was not opposition. It was an internal vulnerability. The response arrived without announcement. In June 2000, Vladimir Gusinsky, owner of NTV, was arrested. There was no prolonged trial, no public negotiation. The terms were delivered privately. Freedom in exchange for ownership. NTV was transferred to Gazprom. Gusinsky left the country. This was not about television. It was a demonstration. It showed that property rights were now conditional, that contracts could be overridden administratively, that influence no longer flowed upward. The system had changed, but the elites did not recalibrate. They told themselves this was personal, a feud, a settling of accounts, an exception. Then the pattern repeated. In 2001, Boris Berezovsky, the oligarch who had helped install Putin, was charged in the Aeroflot case. Again, the choice was binary: prison or exile. Berezovsky fled to London. At this point, the data was no longer ambiguous. Two major power brokers removed, media neutralized, capital stripped of political force. But the remaining oligarchs still believed control persisted. Why? Because Putin had not touched them. Taxes were still negotiable. Assets were still intact. The grand bargain appeared to hold. They mistook restraint for dependence. What they failed to see was structural construction. Putin was building a vertical of power. Authority no longer circulated. It descended. Courts, prosecutors, tax agencies, and security services were being synchronized into a single enforcement mechanism. By the time this architecture was complete, money no longer influenced decisions. It triggered responses. One man continued operating under the old assumptions: Mikhail Khodorkovsky. He funded opposition parties. He lobbied parliament to reduce oil taxes. He spoke publicly about political reform. From his perspective, this was rational. He controlled the strategic resource. He generated national-scale revenue. He believed his importance made him untouchable. In the old system, that belief would have been correct. But the system had already moved on. By 2002, enforcement capacity had fully matured. The state no longer negotiated with capital. It processed it. The final contradiction appeared in 2003. Khodorkovsky moved to sell a major stake of Yukos to ExxonMobil. To him, this was a business decision. To the Kremlin, it was an unacceptable breach. Strategic resources were about to exit the vertical of power. At that moment, the question of control was resolved. The arrest at Novosibirsk was not escalation, it was execution. By the time Khodorkovsky boarded his jet, the outcome had already been decided inside the system. What followed confirmed the shift. Yukos was hit with $27 billion in tax claims, a number designed for insolvency. Its core asset was auctioned. A shell company won. Days later, Rosneft absorbed it. This was not chaos. It was reassignment. Only then did the remaining oligarchs understand the truth. They had never been controlling Putin. They had been operating inside a grace period. When that period ended, control vanished instantly. Money stopped shaping power. Power began shaping money. And once that inversion occurred, there was no path back. Consequences. By the time the oligarchs understood the system had turned against them, it was already too late. There was no opposition to organize, no leverage to apply, no institution left that was not already aligned. The system had reached equilibrium. From that point on, power no longer needed to prove itself internally. It could be projected outward. The first signal appeared almost immediately. In 2008, Russian forces crossed into Georgia. This was not improvisation. It was a calibration, a limited war. short duration, clear objectives, minimal internal resistance. The lesson was simple. The system could deploy force without domestic destabilization. In 2014, the test expanded. Crimea was taken without a conventional battle. The operation relied on speed, ambiguity, and centralized decision-making. No parliamentary debate, no elite dissent, no economic veto. Sanctions followed, but they did not fracture the system. Why? Because the system had already been designed to absorb isolation. Energy revenues were centralized, capital flight was expected, opposition pressure had no institutional entry point. The assumption that once constrained power, that economic elites could impose limits, no longer applied. By 2015, the system moved beyond regional recalibration. Russia entered Syria. This was not about territorial gain, it was about signal transmission. The system could sustain expeditionary warfare. It could operate under sanctions. It could ignore reputational costs. Internally, nothing shifted. The vertical held. By 2022, the final variable was tested. Ukraine was not a tactical operation. It was a systemic gamble. The calculation was not about battlefield brilliance. It was about whether centralized authority could outlast pressure, economic, military, and informational, without internal fracture. What followed exposed the true nature of the system. The war did not produce elite revolt. It did not produce mass defection. It did not produce institutional collapse. Instead, it produced adaptation. Mobilization replaced surprise. Attrition replaced maneuver. Endurance replaced speed. The same logic that neutralized the oligarchs now absorbed war. This is the consequence of the original miscalculation. They believed they were selecting a manager. They were enabling a structure that does not depend on persuasion, a structure that does not bargain with wealth, a structure that treats resistance as a variable to be processed. This is why the story does not end with Khodorkovsky, and it does not end with Crimea, and it does not end with Ukraine. Because the question was never, who is Vladimir Putin? The question was, what kind of system did they build, and what does it do once no one can stop it? That answer is still unfolding. And the next chapters will not be decided by personalities. They will be decided by whether systems designed for control can adapt to limits they cannot command. If you want to understand where this leads next, don't watch speeches, watch structures, watch incentives, watch what the system punishes and what it protects. And ask yourself one question. If they thought they controlled Putin, who thinks they control the system now?